Hello and welcome to our program today, Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army, with Adam Mendelson and Jonathan Sarna. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I will be moderating this program today. The Jewish Heritage Center collects, preserves, and illuminates the history of Jewish New England and beyond to connect people with their heritage and to educate a wide audience about the American Jewish experience. We are located in Boston at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society, America's founding genealogical organization. We are so pleased to host this program today in partnership with the Chappell Manuscript Foundation, which has created the Chappell roster of Jewish service in the Civil War, a remarkable and extensive database of Jewish military service. A few years ago, we at the Jewish Heritage Center worked with Chappell to include a Civil War diary from our archives, the diary of Adolphus Strassman, that was included in the roster. And so we have long been aware of the important work they are doing to research and document American Jewish service on both sides of the Civil War. We will learn more about this important collection in the course of the coming program. But before we get started, I just wanted to make a few housekeeping notes. You in the audience will be muted throughout, and if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to get to as many of them as we can following Adam and Jonathan's conversation. Also, as we are broadcasting from 3 different locations today, we ask you to bear with us if we experience any technological issues. Even if there are any glitches on your end or on ours, we will send you a link to the full recording of this session afterwards so that you can watch and share it later. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our featured speakers today. Adam Mendelson is Associate Professor in Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. His work focuses on how Jews adapted to living within English-speaking lands in the 19th century. In addition to Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, which was just published in November 2022 and is the subject of today's talk, Adam is author of The Rag Race, which compares the economic trajectory of Jews in the United States and the British Empire. He is also co-editor of Jews and the Civil War, a Reader, and other publications. Adam directs the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town, which is the only center of its kind conducting research focused on Jews in South Africa. He joins us today from Cape Town. Jonathan Sarna is University Professor and the Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. He is also Chief Historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and he chairs the academic advisory and editorial boards of the American Jewish Archives. Among his many publications, he is author of the books Lincoln and the Jews, and When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Jonathan Sarna serves on the Jewish Heritage Center's Advisory Council, and we are grateful for his generous time and counsel. So without further ado, welcome Adam and Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Rachel, and Adam, wonderful to see you. And first, we ought to congratulate you. You not only have a new book, you have a new baby. And really wonderful news. Now, I thought we'd start simply by observing yours is not the first book on Jews and the Civil War. Many of us grew up on a great classic by the late Bertram W. Korn, and there are other books. I wonder if you could share what really makes your volume distinctive?
It's a very good question, and it really does build on what has come before, including, Jonathan, your own books on Lincoln and the Jews and on General Orders Number 11 issued by Ulysses S. Grant, something we can talk about later. What does make my book different is that it really focuses on the everyday experience of Jewish soldiers in the Union Army. So what is the texture and experience of really ordinary soldiers, ordinary, in many cases, immigrants, in an army which is thrown together and then grows vastly in size? What is the experience in an army also where Christianity dominates in a whole variety of ways? So this both focus on the individual experience and collective experience of Jews is very much the focus. And we look at both the experiences with what is it like to be a Jew in terms of religious practice, in terms of everyday experience, in terms of anti-Semitism, and also what are the patterns we see in the numbers when it comes to Jews as well. And when do they enlist? What are their backgrounds? What is common to Jewish soldiers?
It's wonderful. And of course, much of that wouldn't have been possible without the new resource that you talk about in the book and that you were able to utilize, which is the Chappelle roster, which I thought might be of considerable interest to our audience today, many of whom are interested in family history, genealogy. So maybe you could take some time and talk about the Chappelle roster and then tell us how it informed your research and maybe how some of our viewers can learn from it and utilize it.
So, as you correctly point out, my book, it draws very heavily on the roster. The roster's been now years in the making. It's a project which began in 2009. It really was a brainchild of Benjamin Chappelle and has involved a team of researchers who set out to identify every Jew who fought in the Union and Confederate armies. And what they've completed so far is a very a lot of work relating particularly to the Union Army. Now they work on the Confederacy, and it's the goal is to be comprehensive. Obviously, they'll recognize that they're individuals they might have missed. So if your relatives or ancestors fought in the war and are not in the roster, they'll please reach out to them, and they'll happily add information that you have. What did they seek to do? They sought to, as I said, identify every Jewish soldier who fought in both armies. And that's more complicated than it seems, because it involves both verifying military service and also verifying Jewishness. And often the former is easier to do than the latter. That they're particularly when it comes to the Union Army, there are a number of different kinds of military records which they've turned to. Both wartime records, but also pension records after the war, which demonstrate and point to evidence of military enlistment in the Union Army. And Jewishness is more complicated, in part because to be a Jew before and during the war is something which is different from Europe at that time, for example. That's increasingly this is a voluntary identity, that membership of a synagogue or of another Jewish organization is not by no means universal. So it has required an enormous amount of effort and time on the part of the researchers to try and tease out who is Jewish amongst the more than 2 million soldiers who fought in the Union Army. In the process of developing this vast database, which is now accessible to anyone who wants to look at it, it's a wonderful website and research portal which allows you to search the roster. In the process of collecting all of the data, and here it's both military records, pension records, marriage records, obituaries, photographs, a tremendous range of material which is now easily accessible. In the process of doing this and assembling this database, the team involved came to the realization that there were broader stories to tell here, hence the desire to have a book focused on the experience of Jews in the Union Army. And the way in which this was transformative to me is really twofold. One, it allowed me to do what any other researcher now using the Chappell roster can do, which is to really hone in on individuals, to really understand at a very local level, an individual level, what it's like, what the experience of thousands of ordinary Jews were in the army. So it certainly allows for that, but also it allows for a helicopter view, a telescope, a macro view, a view from above, looking at putting all these Jewish soldiers together and trying to then tease out, what are the patterns in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of when they enlist, why they enlist, the length of enlistment, age profile, etc., etc., etc. So really to get a big data portrait of Jews in the army. And that what really allows for is comparison then. What is different about the experience of Jews from other minorities in the army, or other immigrants in the army? And there's a literature on the Germans and the Irish and Scandinavians and other groups. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to really get a sense of how and why is it different to be a Jew in the Union Army.
You want to say a word on what your conclusions were about what was different about being a Jew?
So a whole variety of differences that other groups encounter prejudice, but Jews are distinct in one important way, in that the prejudice, the anti-Semitism arises very early in the war. Certainly there's strong anti-Irish sentiments, anti-German sentiment, which develops in the war, but typically develops somewhat later. Remember, the war begins in April of 1861. Germans and Irish don't encounter the sort of prejudice that Jews do very early on. They have greater troubles in 1863 and 1864. Jews encounter prejudice really in the summer of 1861, when the whole variety of scandals erupt in the press, and Jews are blamed for supplying the army, unfairly blamed for supplying the army with substandard, shoddy uniforms and tents and otherwise. So certainly right from the beginning, Jews have this encounter with prejudice, which turns a number of them off the idea of enlistment. So that's certainly, in some ways, is a different experience, that they're wary of the war from in some cases from early on, although plenty of Jews do enlist. But then also another key difference, which I think informs Jewish experience in a whole variety of ways, which are different from other immigrant groups, other minority groups, is that because of the settlement patterns of Jews, where Jews moved to before the war, that Jews are scattered in many cases in the countryside. They are peddlers, they're hawkers, they are selling goods in the Midwest and other rural areas. And yes, there are substantial Jewish populations in the city, but this pattern of dispersion is somewhat different is distinctive for Jews as opposed to other large immigrant groups. And again, this has a very significant consequence during the war, because you must remember that enlistment is local, that regiments are raised in particular locales, and the people who enlist will come from that particular area. And it means that, yes, Jews in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and Cincinnati will enlist in regiments where there are other Jews. But for many Jews who enlist in the army, who don't live in larger cities, instead live in the countryside, in small towns, they will often be the only Jew in a regiment of 1,000 men, or amongst one or two other Jews in a regiment. And that again is different from other immigrant groups, where we instead see the emergence of, for example, ethnic units, ethnic regiments, German and Irish and Scandinavian regiments, brigades, and sometimes even there's a German corps. And that means that Germans are amongst other Germans in the army. The same with Irish, etc. But Jews, it's more typical for them to be somewhat isolated, to not be amongst many other Jews, and that shapes their experience. It's lonely, it's difficult for Jews in many cases. They don't have this sort of strength in numbers that we see with other immigrant and minority populations.
And some Jews even hid their identity for that reason. I think maybe we should back up and give our audience a little bit of background on American Jewish life in the Civil War era? How many Jews are we talking about? Where were they living? Where did they come from? What place did they occupy in American society? Maybe give us the context for those who haven't studied your books and mine.
That's a good question, an important context. We estimate probably around 150,000 Jews in America at the time of the Civil War, and most of them are new immigrants. Most of them are, not all certainly, but most of them are individuals who've arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, most but not all from Central Europe. Again, there is no Germany yet at this point in time, but they're coming from the German states or principalities and kingdoms in Central Europe. And they are flocking to America primarily for economic reasons, although many of them come after a series of failed liberal revolutions in Europe in 1848, and they see America both as a place of economic opportunity, a place to escape the discrimination which they certainly encounter as Jews in Central Europe, and also a place where they can embrace a whole variety of freedoms, religious and other freedoms, which are unimaginable to them in Central Europe. So it's a population, Jewish population, which grows very quickly in these two pre-war decades, in the 1840s and 1850s. And as I alluded to earlier, many of them will indeed settle in New York and Philadelphia and other cities, and likewise the boom cities of the Midwest, which are growing rapidly in these same decades. So Cincinnati, Chicago, etc. And others will seek their fortunes in the countryside. This common practice of peddling as a means of putting one's feet on the ladder towards, hopefully, they hope, upward mobility. Their place in society, so certainly Jews are, as we already described, it's a very different experience than in Europe. That this is an experience where they can decide, make for themselves what they want their identity and their religion to be. So it's certainly this moment of ferment and creativity in American Jewish life. But it's a American Jewry at this point in time, which it's certainly beginning to develop some of the institutions which we are familiar with in Jewish life. But really, this is an incipient point, a point in which of an earliest institution building, certainly the proliferation of synagogues, but there isn't yet there certainly are rival, particularly religious leaders who are trying to claim to speak for the community, but otherwise it's less a community, I would argue, and more of an immigrant population with bringing a whole variety of identities with them to the United States. And many of them still at this point in the 1840s, 1850s in particular, they certainly want to join the middle class, but many of them are scratching a living in America, trying to work their way up within society.
So the war begins, and there's a call to arms. How did it affect Jews? You mentioned the early years and its complexity, and I seem to remember that you had a slide as well that sheds light on some of this, and I think people would enjoy seeing it. How did the whole system work? It's very different than, say, World War II.
Absolutely. So if we look at our second slide, this is a recruiting poster for a regiment which is raised in Pennsylvania, largely raised actually in Philadelphia, and it's raised by a Jewish man by the name of Max Friedman, who has a pre-war career in a militia unit, in a Pennsylvania militia unit. And this is typical of how regiments are raised, particularly early on in the war, where an individual, either because of their wealth, their status, or perhaps their military background, will raise regiments and then try to have these regiments mustered in by the federal government. And this is exactly what Max Friedman does. He tries to he successfully raises a cavalry regiment. He's not, in fact, the only Jew in Pennsylvania who does exactly this at exactly this moment in time. In fact, so this is the recruiting poster, which you see in front of you over here. And on the right-hand side, this is a photograph, an early photograph of the camp of the regiment, which is ultimately raised, which is the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And we see Jews in certainly the early months of the war caught up in that same tremendous excitement and sense of patriotic duty, which we see it within the broader society as well. That Jews are enlisting at this point in time, in many cases, for the Union. They can talk later perhaps about their views of slavery and their views of emancipation, their views of Lincoln. But at this point in time, there's a real sense of rallying to the flag to defend the Union. And again, these are all volunteers who certainly at this point in time aren't expecting that the war will last as long as it did, and certainly are perhaps anticipating a very different sort of war than materializes too, that they're certainly people like Max Friedman with pre-war militia experience, but also a number of Jewish veterans from European armies are anticipating a quick, far cleaner, far more perhaps romantic war than the one which eventuates. So we see actually a number of these early Jewish officers like Max Friedman, who ultimately don't actually last very long within the army. They are, in his case, I think he resigns to spare himself from embarrassment, perhaps for legal reasons as well. And this is typical of a number of other Jewish officers. You can see that, in fact, the next slide is of the very disreputable the Ustasi brothers from Hungary, their recruiting poster. You can see that this is a regiment raised in New York, the Garibaldi Guard, again promising to provide a safe place, a heroic place for immigrants from a whole variety of different European backgrounds. And again, they plus Max Friedman, who we spoke about a moment ago, again, their war does not end well. That in fact, the man on the right ends his war in prison. And this is not atypical. That there's really a mismatch in many cases between expectation and reality when it comes to military service. We see the opposite in interesting ways with a number of other Jewish men who enlist, sometimes who enlist for a whole variety of reasons, sometimes economic reasons, and instead finding that they actually are very capable in the ranks and rise to positions of prominence and become quite distinguished as officers. In fact, that's true too of the man on the front cover of the book itself, Edward Solomon, someone who proves himself to be a very, very capable officer, becomes effectively the commanding officer of his regiment. He's a lieutenant colonel. The colonel is absent, and serves with great distinction. So we see a variety of patterns of this kind in terms of early enlistment, but certainly tremendous enthusiasm very early on. That in April of 1861, we see the single largest burst of enlistment by Jews during the entire war. And as I've described to you already, that enthusiasm begins to wane several months later because of this quite vicious anti-Semitism which we see developing on the home front.
I think you had an anti-Semitic cartoon that people
Absolutely.
might want to see connected with enlistment.
Absolutely. So this is the next slide is exactly this. This is typical of exactly what you've described. And what this plays upon this cartoon, which is one of many which appear in 1861, plays upon this idea quite directly that Jews are preferring to profit from the war than to enlist in the war. And again, of course, this has the effect of persuading Jews, why should we sort of sacrifice, but put ourselves at risk when our patriotism is being doubted? So it has this unintended effect. So what this refers to, and I've spoken about briefly a little bit earlier, are these claims that Jews in particular make up a disproportionate share of military contractors who their detractors claim are profiting from supplying substandard goods to the Union Army, and likewise, these detractors point to a tremendous amount of corruption in these supply contracts. Remember that the Federal Army prior to the war is 15,000 strong, so a very, very small army in 1860. And this is an army which will then grow to hundreds of thousands strong in 1860 by the end of the year, and then grow only larger as the war goes on. So there's tremendous opportunity here for some scrupulous and unscrupulous contractors to make money supplying this army. And much of that blame for problems with supply of the army and corruption in the supply process will fall on Jews, and very much so these anti-Semitic ideas as reflected in this cartoon. And what's reflected here too is another interesting phenomenon, which is that the term shoddy, which we know as referring to substandard goods, is actually a technical term which is used in the clothing industry prior to the war. It refers to wool which has been ground apart and would typically only then be used as insulation or stuffing for a coat or jacket or for another item of clothing, not something you would use to weave a uniform jacket or pants out of. And some unscrupulous contractors, including, by the way, Brooks Brothers, a major contractor during the war, not a Jewish firm, they supply the army with shoddy uniforms made out of shoddy, which the press delights in describing as falling apart in the first rains of the summer of 1861. So these accounts of naked soldiers in the field, or almost naked, the uniforms have collapsed. And again, this idea of shoddy patriotism then takes hold, that Jews are guilty of shoddy patriotism. As I said, this is a classic case of projecting all sorts of unhappiness, anxieties, etc., onto a minority, onto Jews, who really there are these ideas in circulation about Jewish business practices. The war provides a perfect moment then for for all of these anxieties to focus on Jews in particular.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you have patriotism and corruption as part of the same story, just as we see today in the Ukraine. This is typical in wartime. Naturally, both coexisted. Nobody denies that there is corruption, but the problem was the people who only saw that part of the story. Nobody can deny there was great patriotism, and one somehow has to see both of those together. I know you have some more material on wartime anti-Semitism, and given interest today in anti-Semitism, my students imagine that anti-Semitism began about the year 2000. So it's important to remind people how important the Civil War was in terms of anti-Semitism. And I wonder if you could talk about anti-Semitism and its impact now that we've seen that cartoon and other anti-Semitica.
Absolutely. So very good question. And the experience of Jews in the ranks is very varied. That in many cases, their Jewishness again is the subject of comment, is unfamiliar to those among whom they are serving. But the experience of serving shoulder to shoulder alongside one another at close proximity over months and sometimes over years serves to completely normalize Jews. In fact, we see plenty of examples of this kind, that very, very close bonds of comradeship develop between Jews and others. And this is reflected in a whole variety of documents during the war and then after the war as well, where soldiers will write about their sense of kinship with those with whom they spend this intense time, and they really are relying on each other in the most sort of a very, very tight-knit way. So we certainly have plenty of examples that. We also have examples of philo-Semitism, of a sense of excitement at meeting Jews sometimes as well, that we have descriptions, for example, of a Jewish soldier who's pulled out of the ranks. He's marching past an officer and he's pulled aside, and this officer is tremendously excited to meet a real living Jew, again, someone who has read about Jews in the Bible and clearly has a very particular set of ideas, romantic ideas about Jews, but to really meet a living, live Jew is a matter of great excitement. So we see that side as well. But also we see the opposite. We also see individual soldiers who particularly, again, and this speaks to my earlier point about isolation and dispersion of Jews in the army, where some have the misfortune of serving alongside those who taunt them, who torment them, who mistreat them, and again, a whole variety of cases which have survived in the historical record of this kind. So a soldier by the name of Max Glass, who describes being tormented by his fellow soldiers, appealing to his officer for his captain for support, and he's ignored, and these torments continuing then over weeks and perhaps months until he deserts, because he's chased down the street by his fellow soldiers who call him Christ killer. He has mud thrown upon him, etc. He's tripped as he's marching. And we see other soldiers again who also have experienced these sort of torments. But again, relatively rare in the historical record, but certainly cases of this kind. And interesting cases where likewise Jewish soldiers will appeal to their officers when they are experiencing torment of this kind, and then will be, in many cases, I think, this sympathetic response. They move to another unit, another company. So certainly we have a variety of experiences of that kind. One of the things that my book argues is that, yes, there are these experiences at the individual level, but the war also leaves a very interesting legacy at the collective level as well. And here, one of the things that I suggest is that a wartime environment, this overheated environment where there are all sorts of fears, anxieties, paranoias within society, some of which are directed at other groups. So certainly at the Germans and the Irish and African Americans will experience in the Union a great deal of prejudice, particularly later in the war. But certain ideas, some of which we've alluded to already, this idea of Jews as shoddy contractors, Jews as unfair beneficiaries of the war. And in fact, we see this in slide number 5, these ideas that the war has upturned the natural social order. So this is a cartoon which again contrasts the experience of a patriotic soldier and of the contractor. So the experience of the soldier on the left and the contractor and his wife on the right, that one and his family is struggling and suffering, and the other are living in great luxury. Is the ideas which developed during the war that the natural order of things has been upset, that both economically and socially, and that a whole variety of groups in society who should be shunned, who should be socially and economically marginal, have thrived. And these ideas, again, during and after the war, will focus in some cases on Jews. And I argue that that's the seedbed of the anti-Semitism that we see, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s. A lot of this will draw upon ideas which take root during the war in particular. So it has this important legacy. And another legacy, a related legacy, is I argue that in a way also the war, because Jews encounter this adversity during the war, they encounter anti-Semitism of this kind during the war actually transforms a Jewish population into a Jewish community. That we see Jews who previously have identities as Bavarian Jews or Jews from Hesse or from all sorts of localities in Europe and elsewhere, because they face this collective and common threat during the war, but they begin to actually develop a strong sense of American Jewishness, which then asserts itself more powerfully after the war as well. And that's again in response to this, in some cases, unpleasant wartime environment that Jews encounter.
Yeah, one of the exciting pieces of your book is that you don't end at appomattox like so many Civil War books do. You carry the story beyond that, and really talk about memory of the war, the creation of veterans organizations. Maybe you want to say a word about that, because it's different than many of us believe before your scholarship.
Sure. So let's go to the last slide, slide number 9, to discuss exactly this. It's really a wonderful photograph and wonderful medals here too. These are medals from the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, which is created, as the title suggests, by Jewish veterans of the Civil War in the 1890s. And this in the middle is a man by the name of Isidore Isaacs in the uniform, actually not of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, but of the Grand Army of the Republic of the Union Veterans, the General Union Veterans Association, but a man who plays very active in both organizations. So we certainly see that phenomenon emerging amongst Jewish veterans, but relatively late. We see the emergence of the Hebrew Union Veterans Association, as I said, in the 1890s. That's close to 3 decades after the end of the war. And one of the striking things that your question points to is that Jews are not hasty to remember the war in the decades immediately after it ends. And this is different from other groups who fight in the war. This is different from African Americans and the Irish and Germans who are very proud of the collective sacrifices of their communities during the war and make a great deal of that sacrifice immediately afterwards. For Jews, it takes longer. It's not because there's an absence of heroic Jews, of Jews who fought in the army. Instead, I think it's because the war in the minds, my argument at least, is the war in the minds of many Jews who've lived through it on their home front, is a very, very complicated experience, a memory of a war where Jews have encountered exclusion and anti-Semitism, and they have memory of General Grant's General Orders Number 11 and other issues during the war where they have been made to feel like outsiders. And so my sense is that immediately after the war, instead, many Jews just want to move on. They want the community to move on as well, focus on the future, as opposed to this rather troubling recent past. So there's much less talk about the war, much less celebration with the Jewish community of veterans, really until the 1890s. And in fact, there's I argue, a rediscovery of the Civil War, rediscovery of veterans during that decade. And I argue it's defensive. It's actually in response to a new wave of anti-Semitism, which accelerates during that period, which is again stimulated by the mass arrival of Jews from Eastern Europe. And the anti-Semites make the argument that these new arrivals who are flocking to America's shores for safety, that they can never become, these Jews can never become patriotic citizens of the United States, that there's something intrinsically problematic about Jews, that they are disloyal, that they're shoddy patriots, to use the term of the Civil War era. And one of the reasons why we see the celebration of Jewish service during the war in the 1890s is to counter exactly that, is to say a war which is still in living memory, which is still a war which matters a huge amount to American society in the 1890s. This is a proving ground for our loyalty. Look at all these veterans who served. Look at how loyal we were. And this is a perfect counter to the anti-Semites who argue otherwise.
Right. And that's why the Hebrew Union veterans are only founded in the 1890s, not as one might have expected earlier. For those who don't know, that later becomes the Jewish war veterans after Spanish-American War and then World War I. But fascinatingly and different than World War I and II, where tremendous efforts were made, even during the war, to document everything that Jews did and their patriotism and so on. What you show us is that in the Civil War, much of that comes later, really in response to anti-Semites. An infamous one was a man named Goldwin Smith, as you say, who questioned whether Jews even fought in the war. And even someone like Mark Twain initially in Concerning the Jews, later he writes a correction, wonders how patriotic Jews were. So it becomes a very, very important theme. I see that time is fleeting, but I want to make sure the story you tell is, of course, here a Union story. In the Confederacy, even war memorialization, as you know, that everybody knows there's a Jewish, unusual Jewish Confederate cemetery at Richmond. But the story in the Confederacy is different. You're now working on Jews in the Confederate Army. Maybe as a final question before we go to the audience, you can give us a foretaste of some of the differences you see between what you found here in the Union Army and some of your early discoveries about the Confederacy.
So the Confederacy is different in a variety of very interesting ways. We certainly see Jews rising to very prominent positions within the Confederate government, also senior positions, more senior positions within the Confederate Army too. Again, they're typically Jews from families which have been long settled in the Confederacy. Obviously, there's a much smaller Jewish population in the states which will comprise the Confederacy. So if there are 150,000 Jews in the United States in 1860, perhaps 25,000 of them are in the Confederacy. Some of them are settled in South Carolina and Georgia and elsewhere, long settled, and families who have been there for generations by this point in time. But likewise, there's an influx of Jews from Central Europe into the Confederacy too. And another of the striking features about a Jewish service in the Confederacy is we see these interesting varieties of experience. There are those who are deeply committed to the Confederate cause, without question, and some of them are immigrants, but more of them are those from these storied families of individuals who've grown up in the South and really see themselves as part of Southern culture. But we also see a fascinating pattern, or at least I'm seeing this in the diaries and letters which I'm reading, which is of particularly new immigrants serving in the Confederate Army. It became very, very difficult not to serve in the Union Army, that the conscription hoovers up, vacuums up almost anyone between the ages of sort of 60 and 45 by the end of the war. And Jews are certainly caught in this. It becomes very difficult to not, as I said, to serve. But likewise, there are clearly good numbers of Jews who perhaps rightfully recent immigrants who decide early on that this is not the war for them and make concerted efforts, considerable efforts to try and get out of the Confederate Army. And again, it's a feature which I don't think has been adequately recognized in the literature so far. This really very varied experience of Jews in the Confederate Army. So much like the book on the Union, what I'm drawing on certainly the letters and diaries of those who fought, and really looking at these individual experiences as well. What does it mean to be a Jew? What is your encounter with your with fellow Jews, but also what is your experience in that case, an even more of a Christian army, an army where there are revivals, religious revivals, Christian revivals, particularly later in the war. What is the experience as a Jew with that environment? What is your experience with anti-Semitism? Again, how frequently or otherwise do you encounter your fellow Jews? And there clearly are a whole variety of very interesting differences in the story.
We could go on. It's such a wonderful and rich book, and I just want to say there are all sorts of individual stories in your book, some of which overturn past wisdom, where in one case, someone we all thought was killed in the war, you brought him back to life. It was wonderful. But I think that we have quite a number of questions from the audience, And I think it's time that we turn to those questions. So thank you. And I encourage everybody to read this book. And Rachel, if you can help us by asking some of the questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. And that was just fascinating and clearly the tip of the iceberg for the book. We all want to dive in now and learn much more. There is great interest from the audience, and where to begin. Adam, there are some questions about daily life in the Army, especially around Jewish observance. If you're mentioning that a number of these soldiers may be the only Jew in a unit, how are they able to stay kosher? Are they able to observe Shabbat? Are they able to explain these things to their fellow soldiers? Can you give us a taste of what Jewish life might have been or not been?
Absolutely, it's a wonderful question. I devote a whole chapter to dealing specifically to what does it mean in terms of religion for Jews in the army. And let's turn to one of the images I supplied relating to exactly this. And this is image number 6. And this is again a surprising find. This image, it comes from the New York Illustrated News, sort of major newspaper, and it's a drawing which is submitted to the newspaper by what it describes as a Hebrew volunteer, really without comment, is published in the newspaper. But to me, is very revealing, because obviously what the Hebrew volunteer wants to, the Jewish soldier, in other words, what he wants to emphasize is what the army subsists on. What your rations consist of. And it's an army which subsists on, heavily on pork. And soldiers complain, Jewish and non-Jewish complain about the endless varieties of pork which is served, that's usually endless varieties of salt pork, which is served to them. And so certainly, it presents that obvious problem to Jewish soldiers. And in fact, there's an interesting, again, a letter to a Jewish newspaper about exactly this, where a soldier who's seemingly himself is Orthodox, again passes comment on this, where in essence doesn't want to discourage his fellow Jews from enlisting, but in essence suggests to them that this is one of the sacrifices you'll need to make, that in reality, if you want to eat, you're going to have to accommodate yourself to eating what is available. And likewise, there's a tremendous, soldiers are often very hungry. So we see, again, a common feature in the letters and diaries which I've read is what they've managed to forage, and they eat an extraordinary range of wild animals, again, many of which are not kosher, but they also hold out a great hope for the food which is sent from home. And again, it's a wonderful demonstration of the connections between the home front and soldiers in the field, often away from home for months, often sometimes for years on end. And they live in an expectation of these care packages, which are these trunks of food which are sent. One of my favorite soldiers described in the book, a soldier who wrote wonderful letters home to his wife, a soldier by the name of Marcus Spiegel, describes to his wife, again, sends her various hints about what he would like in his care package, in his trunk, and alcohol and coffee and foods of various kinds, and then describes how his mouth is watering at the expectation of the trunk is arriving. And then there's a wonderful, again, letter back thanking his wife and describing the wonders of eating pickled duck tongue while on the march. That's so clearly something great delicacy to him. So certainly there are issues, challenges, let's say, for Jews around food, and particularly in the Union Army, where you're campaigning in most cases well away from larger Jewish population centers, somewhat different in the Confederacy, and this means again that it's difficult to worship as well. We have interesting letters and examples of Jews who do, when they have the opportunity, will go to synagogues, for example, in towns in Virginia which have been taken by the Union Army, and sometimes about the frosty reception that they receive in these synagogues as well. but it's very, very difficult to observe Judaism as a soldier. The Union Army makes a few allowances at all for Jews, relatively few allowances for Christian soldiers as well. There is, again, supposedly on Sunday, opportunity to observe the Sabbath, but certainly no allowance for Jews on Saturday. And certainly, again, I write in the book about this issue about chaplains, about military chaplains, and again, the efforts of Jews to try and appoint military chaplains as well. But the experience, again, is for most Jews is certainly, as I described, as of isolation, of being amongst very few other Jews, but certainly tremendous efforts on some of their part to try and then find other Jews to worship together, to have Passover together, to try and write home to there's a letter, for example, outside Petersburg during the siege of Petersburg, to write to Isaac Mayer Wise to ask him to send religious articles, in other words, prayer shawls, prayer books, etc., so that Jewish soldiers can worship together. Again, a siege ironically provides that sort of opportunity, sort of a moment of stasis. The armies aren't moving. This is a chance for Jews to actually worship together. But again, we have challenges of various kinds. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we have 18 questions, so I want to see if we can get at least a few more of them in. So, Rachel, yeah.
So Karen is asking, how does the affiliation of Jewish veterans affect their connections to political parties? Were they loyal to the Republican Party? So you talked a little bit about that sort of later rise of the veterans organizations and the initial sort of avoidance of the war, wanting to move on. But is there any sort of track from serving in the Army, to political causes?
It's a great question, and I'll again, it's a complicated question that Jews, again, and I'll have to generalize, but Jews prior to the war, and in many cases during the war, are more closely aligned with the Democratic Party, as are many other immigrants. That it's a party which is seen to protect and advance immigrant rights and interests. And we see that not amongst all Jews, but certainly that's a pattern we see amongst Jews. We see a number of Jews who do enlist, beginning the war as Democrats and then becoming Republicans as the war wears on. And this is also a pattern we see amongst other soldiers too, that the soldier vote is very important to Lincoln in the election of 1864, for example. And some of that, but again, the question really asks about what happens after the war. We see a mixed picture there too, that some remain loyal to the Republican Party, but others, for all sorts of local reasons, will return as veterans, for example, to the Democratic Party. So it's a complicated picture. I don't think there's a single pattern when it comes to how veterans in particular Jewish veterans behave after the war.
Right. 1868 election is particularly fraught because Ulysses S. Grant had expelled Jews from his war zone. What happens when you support the party, but you worry about the candidate of that party? And that's another book, and it's a very good and complicated question. Rachel, let's see if we can get further on the list. Yeah.
Let's see. Lewis asks, which was more impactful, Jews learning how to successfully coexist with non-Jewish fellow soldiers, or non-Jews learning what Jews are really like in person and learning to coexist with them? How did the Civil War change these relations on a large scale?
Fascinating question. I mean, I think for Jewish soldiers in particular, many of them, particularly those who've lived in the countryside prior to the war, they've already had that experience of having to navigate a largely Christian society, and perhaps different from Jews who live in larger cities. But I think even there, there's been a process of accommodation, adaptation, learning to live as a Jew, as a religious outsider within a broader society, and also to how to explain your background to those that you encounter. I think, though, the experience for Christians who serve amongst Jews, as I've described to you, in many cases, this is their first encounter with a Jew, and again, Jews are unfamiliar to them at least as living individuals, as opposed to as the people from the Bible, and we see again all sorts of different responses as I've described to you already in terms of this encounter with Jews, but I think it has this effect, broad effect of normalization, that a Jew, to borrow a line from one of Jonathan's famous essays, that these become no longer the theoretical Jew, but the Jew next door, the Jew standing alongside one as one marches. And I think that has a very, very considerable effect.
We also have a comment picking up on something you said earlier about saying fascinating perspective on how we became today's Jewish community, this idea that, we are now the Jewish community instead of, immigrants from a particular Bavarian village and so on. So such important history during and emanating from this period. So can you, back to just some basics, can you give us an idea of the percentage of Jewish men who actually, in America, or who served in the Union Army? What does that look like?
It's a good question. It's something which I worked very hard to try and identify, at least develop a sense of what proportion of Jewish men served. And it varies substantially by locality. So higher in some cities and towns than others, and often variation by state. But the comparison, which is interesting to me, is really also with other immigrant groups. How the rate of enlistment amongst Jews compare with that of Irish and Germans in particular? Mm-hmm. And it is lower amongst Jews, but I think for very particular reasons, some of which I've already discussed, which is that anti-Semitism very early on in the war. That diffidence that Jews feel about the war from early on, which is different from Irish and Germans, and also the economic position of Jews is different. The economic roles of Jews are different too. That many Jews are small businessmen in effect. They're running a small store and they're peddlers. They're effectively self-employed, and the consequences of the war for enlistment for them is effectively the war means any length of enlistment means that their business will fold, that they won't have someone who will be able to generate income on their behalf, and that means that there's a particular economic calculus for Jews in terms of enlistment, which is different from Irish and Germans who often are in many cases, not all, but are laborers or otherwise, who are they're not self-employed, they're wage laborers, and a different calculus in terms of enlistment. And I look at all these factors to explain why the rate does differ, but it varies amongst, depending where we're talking about.
And we've had a few questions about how, given this sort of unsavory experience that they were seeing, how Jewish men might have avoided conscription. Were they, was there payment for people to take their place? Do you have examples of that?
We can turn here actually to the first slide. It's a lovely and already quite extraordinary a regimental flag from early on in the war. This from 1862, dedicated from the Jewish ladies of Syracuse, New York, where the Jewish community tries to aid in raising a regiment, and this is the flag in which the regiment will fly on the battlefield. It's quite extraordinary that this is what they wave amongst above them as they go into battle. Certainly conscription, I think, has been somewhat misunderstood, at least in the Union. That there are conscription is introduced in 1863. And it creates all sorts of political and other social problems on the home front. But there are all sorts of ways for Jews and non-Jewish individuals who want to avoid conscription to do so. That actually a relatively small percentage of the army are unwilling conscripts, So I think the vast majority of Jews who enlist are volunteers as opposed to conscripts. Yes, you can hire a substitute. There are other ways to evade conscription, but I think that at least when it comes to Union, conscription has been overblown to some extent.
Great, thank you. Well, that is all the time we have for questions. I want to thank Adam Mendelson and Jonathan Sarna so much for their time and just this incredible look into this book and into this entire subject. There's so much to learn. So we encourage folks to read this important book, Jewish Soldiers in the Civil War, the Union Army. It is available through New York University Press, as well as other online booksellers. And before we leave, I just want to let you know about a couple of upcoming programs from the Jewish Heritage Center. In March, we are offering a 3-part course, Behind the Golden Doors, Jewish Acculturation in the Era of Immigration Restriction. This is looking at Jewish immigrants and first-generation experience in the first half of the 20th century. That is in March. And also in March, we are co-sponsoring a program with Vilna Shul here in Boston, Ghosts in the Gallery, Historic Synagogues, and American Jewish Religion. You can learn more on our website at jewishheritagecenter.org. And I just want to thank you all for joining us today. As you leave the program, you'll be asked to take a brief survey about this, this presentation, and we hope you'll take just a minute to fill it out, as your feedback is very valuable to us to developing further programming. We'll also be sending you a link, a follow-up email with a link to this presentation. I do invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. And I'd like to mention that this free program was made possible by donations to the Jewish Heritage Center and to the New England Historic Genealogical Society from people all over the world. We ask that you might consider as well making a donation to support our educational and archival work. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll join us again, and goodbye until next time.